Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Duncan Kay from the Think City Institute, and I'd like to welcome everybody from Malaysia and around the world to the fifth in our series of Earth Day webinars that we've been hosting this week in celebration of Earth Day. And we still have two more to come over the weekend. And Ramadan Kareem to all of you who have started fasting today. I imagine that this is probably going to be a Ramadan that no one's going to forget. I hope that you've all had a chance to mark Earth Day with something meaningful. Perhaps you've made a pledge to reduce waste, to walk more, or maybe you've even planted a tree. The pledge adopted by my family was to start observing meat-free Mondays. So if you've got a pledge, why not tell us about it in the chat box? So today's topic is climate change and COVID-19, a tale of two crises. Now, what's become apparent to me over the past few weeks of lockdown is that people are starting to question our way of life, and that perhaps we can't go back to our old ways, and we might just embrace the new normal. Our speakers today are both experts in the field, and we're very lucky to have them join us, as I know that they're both extremely busy people. We have joining us Dr. Kriban from Friends of Bukit, Kiara, who's a friend and neighbor of mine, and Sofia Castelo, a friend and colleague of mine here at Think City. So our first speaker is Sofia Castelo, who by her name, you might guess that she's not Malaysian. Sofia is originally from Portugal, but is now based in Penang as co-lead of Think City's resilience team. And she's in charge of the nature-based climate adaptation program for the urban areas of Penang Island. She holds a degree in landscape architecture and postgraduate degrees in project management and climate change and sustainable development policies. She's got 20 years of experience in designing and managing landscape and urban design projects in Europe, China, the USA, Australia, and Malaysia. She's a co-founder of the NGO Mulheres na Arquitectura, which I'm sure she put in there just to try and make me slip up, which means women in architecture. And she's committed to the empowerment of women in the public space and in the architecture profession. Several of her projects have been awarded by prestigious organizations such as different landscape institutes, UNESCO, and in fact, even the United Nations. Sofia is going to be explaining how the COVID crisis might become an opportunity for us all when dealing with climate change. So I'd like to invite Sofia into the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Duncan, for your kind words. I swear I did not add the Portuguese name to trick you. So I'll be talking about how the two crises develop differently and how can we shift from crisis mode to opportunity by building environmental and social resilience. So we'll discuss differences and similarities of the crisis, humankind's connection to nature as a possible cause of the problem, opportunities for climate action, and building social and environmental resilience in a post-COVID world. So there are substantial differences between the two crises. Foremost, COVID-19 has had a time span, a lifespan, a very short lifespan. So it was identified in China in December 2019, and a pandemic was declared in March 11th, 2020. So it's now 24th of April, and our lives have completely changed. As for climate change, the basic science of climate change was identified in the 19th century, and the threat was understood in the 60s. So while climate science is very well understood and uncertainties exist, but are a result of the complexity of the systems, COVID-19 is not yet fully understood despite the genetic sequence as being published in January 2020. So basically the source of the threat is very, very different. For climate change, it's basically a high concentration of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere resulting of human activity. The communality with COVID-19 is that there may be human impacts in the origin of the virus, as animal-to-human transmission can result of wildlife trade. In terms of level impact, there's no comparison. So COVID-19 impacts human health and mainly the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions. Despite the existing uncertainties, this is what is known. Climate change impacts the planetary system. And in terms of human society, the most vulnerable communities and countries will be the most impacted. So in terms of similarities, Yale University identified precisely the same stages of denial for both crises. So stage 1, the crisis is not happening. Stage 2, it's not humans that are to blame. Stage 3, it's not that bad. Stage 4, solutions are too costly, so it's better not to address it. And stage 5, it's too late to act. However, reality has a way of imposing, overcoming denial. And in the case of COVID-19, that came pretty fast. So the virus and the disease brought the world to a halt in just approximately 3 months. The differences in impact, it's not only in terms of number of people, but in degree of impact. We are all locked at homes and we are at our homes and we are all being impacted, but that's very different from having our homes destroyed and our livelihoods forever changed. It's also very different in the fact that COVID-19 is a new event, very recent event, and there's no movement behind this. All the changes we've been experiencing are not backed by an international movement, while climate change has a strong movement that has started with the environmental movement and the first Earth Day, which took place in USA in 1970. Actually, this poster is the original poster of the first Earth Day. There are differences between the environmental movement and the climate movement because they were, in the 70s, they were very focused on pollution, air pollution. And it is assumed that the publishing of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson initiated the environmental movement. And it's a book about the impact of chemicals in nature, particularly pesticides. What we see here is that actually Earth Day had a positive impact. They were addressing the issues of pollution, and we see on the right, this green graph, pollution has come down in the countries that were protesting, despite on the left side, emissions kept on going. We also see that global negotiations for climate change were initiated only in the 90s. So we can see here that tremendous, many conference of parties in which all stakeholders involved, all countries on Earth, in most conference of parties met to discuss the issue, had no impact in the rise of emissions. And the world joins the climate movement. It starts with children, with different countries, but there's tremendous push from the public in order for governments to take action. And this action does not come. Lastly, I would just like to very briefly address the differences of speed of climate change and the virus and COVID-19. Basically, we're all talking about the Earth global system, which has 4 spheres. And the 4 spheres have different processes and very different timelines. For instance, the geosphere has processes that function only in the order of millennia. Climate is a result of an interaction between the hydrosphere and the atmosphere, and the processes are mainly physical processes that carry substantial inertia. So it can take a long time for the manifestation of the processes. As for the biosphere, everything is very fast. It's actually where humans are located in the Earth system. So humans and the virus. So this is why there's such a big difference in fast-paced crisis. Now we're going to talk about humankind's connection to nature. It's a fascinating subject. We're going to approach it in a very short way because we really need to address this issue to address the final conclusions. So humans are destroying nature at an increasingly faster pace. And this is obviously because we think we can live without it. It's heartbreaking to see our impact in biodiversity. 200 species go extinct every single day. 97% of all mammals are humans, cows, and pets. And 70% of all birds on Earth today are chicken. Even though this is a very complex issue that deserves at least one extra webinar, we know that along our evolution on Earth, we've begun to separate ourselves, humankind, from nature. I'm just using a reference and a story of origin of the three main monotheistic religions, which is basically the expulsion from paradise, which is a metaphor of separation from nature. So Adam and Eve were living peacefully integrated in nature and were expelled from that. There are several interesting philosophical books addressing this issue that I highly recommend. And how can we see how much entrenched this notion is that humankind and nature are completely separated? When Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, the shock and awe in society was unbelievable. We were talking about the 19th century. So medicine was quite evolved. So we knew that our organs were very similar to other animals' organs. But just the idea that we could share the evolution with other species on the planet was shocking for most. Despite this separation from nature and this idea that man dominates nature, there are always fears present. So King Kong is a great metaphor for this. It's that man goes into the jungle, but the jungle strikes back at man. And we can see this in COVID-19 crisis. I see many, many people saying that this is a revenge from nature. Obviously, nature does not take revenge. This is a natural response according to natural laws. An action deserves a reaction, is met with a reaction. So for me, this is the best example of the global absurdity of seeing man as being detached from nature. The idea of colonizing Mars is absurd at so many levels. I'm just going to give you an example. I'm not going to talk about atmosphere, energetic costs, the limitations to the population that could colonize Mars. I'm just going to talk about one tiny example to give you an idea of how absurd this is. If we were to live on Mars, our blood could not coagulate properly because Mars has only 38% of Earth gravity, and coagulation of blood is essential to healing wounds, and that would not function properly. This is a very, very, very small example of how deeply connected we are in syntony. We are in perfect syntony with our planet, and the idea of living in another planet is absolutely absurd. Okay, in terms of opportunities for climate action, we must say that this is not the worst of times. We see many people, many global leaders, and many scientists pushing for using this crisis as an opportunity for systems change. We see also the need to have a global view on the problem. So this is actually an extract from a paper published in Science magazine earlier this month, and it's named "The Moment to See the Poor." This is also another benefit of this crisis because everyone's impacted. It's the first time that I see so many people considering vulnerable communities in a fairer light. So just to read the end of this extract, a thorough review of worldviews, lifestyles, and the problems of short-term economic valuation must be carried out. A more responsible, more sharing, more caring, more inclusive, and fairer society is required if we are to survive in the Anthropocene. Okay, we also see leaders like Emmanuel Macron saying that this is a time to think the unthinkable. We see manifestos like this Dutch manifesto with 5 proposals for a better world after the pandemic. And we also see the opportunities that the economic crisis brought by COVID-19 will require a response from governments in terms of economic stimulus. And this economic stimulus should be addressed at building a more sustainable world. In terms of building social and environmental resilience in a post-COVID world. So it's essential to shift from an incremental to a systemic change. And for that, we need to rethink our connection to nature, because if we don't rethink our connection to nature, nothing else will be possible. We need to promote science-based decision-making processes, ensure a fair distribution of resources, and think global but act local. In terms of rethinking our connection with nature, we need to understand that we are absolutely dependent of nature processes, and there's significant wisdom in world's ecosystems and self-regulation mechanisms. The idea that we can live without this is unthinkable, and we need to incorporate this in our way of thinking, in our societies and governments' ways of thinking. One such example is this movement that tries to protect half of the world. The idea is to leave 50% of the planet without any kind of human intervention by 2030. And this is because Earth has a tremendous capacity of self-regenerating. In terms of promoting science-based decision-making processes, this we have seen in the last decades a reversal of centuries of evolution. We need to bring back fact-based, science-based decision-making processes, and we just need to rule out leaders, political leaders that do not abide by these principles. We can also play a part. Please don't share or retweet stories that you have not confirmed or sources dodgy such. Please avoid doing that at all costs. There are many ways of addressing it. If you find a story interesting, but you don't know the source, you can just search it. You can Google it before sharing it. And then we need to ensure a fair distribution of resources. We cannot keep living in a world in which one American uses the resources of equivalent to 5 planets, and one Indian person uses the equivalent to 0.7 planets. So, and then we need to think global and act local. This is probably the most encouraging result we've seen with the COVID crisis. We've seen the world developing global capacity. We've seen countries responding, initiating lockdowns because of according to instructions of other countries and coordinating with other countries. We've seen an incredible amount of sharing of scientific resources and big data. Even Think City has been working, our analytics team has been working 24 hours of 24 hours on this. And this is very important, we need to couple environmental and social vulnerability. We need to address them both combined. In terms of acting local, we need to strengthen community support systems. We need to prioritize local markets because of the lack of sustainability, obviously. And also because of local economies and because local markets also strengthen community support systems. And then finally, we need to empower vulnerable community leaders. It is not the time to stop talking for the vulnerable communities. We need to empower them to have their own voices. Thank you very much. Back to you, Duncan.
Thank you so much, Sofia. That's a really fascinating presentation, and it's raised quite a few questions for me. So I hope you'll join us again in 20 minutes or so when we have our Q&A after our next speaker. So our second speaker today is Dr. Kriban, who has been the president of Friends of Bukit Kiara for the past 2 years. As president, he's been focusing on the organization's efforts in driving the gazettement agenda and developing the narrative for protection of the green lung through engagement with all stakeholders, including the Green Agenda CBOs and NGOs in Klang Valley. He's been passionate about sustainability, the protection of the environment, and the rights of communities throughout his work life. And he's increasingly devoting his time to those endeavors. He studied in Cardiff University in Wales in the field of civil and structural engineering, and he then went on to complete a PhD in Aberdeen in Scotland. He lived and worked in the UK for over a decade, and then spent several years in Botswana in Southern Africa, where he was involved in sustainable design and the development of water resources for desert communities, before returning to Malaysia. He manages an engineering consultancy based in Tamantun, here in KL, which provides specialist design and technology services in the construction space and with regards to heritage structures. So today he's going to be looking at a sort of a community response to climate change and what action communities might want to take. So please do join us, Dr. Kriban.
Thank you, Duncan. Thanks for the introductory comments and background. Let me begin. Must commend Sofia for putting the stage together. It's fascinating that she's managed to compare the two crises we're looking at. But let me begin by looking at the issues. There are certainly lessons to be learned from the two crises, COVID-19 and the climate. I think what comes through very quickly is that both of these issues are deadly and costly. We've seen this in terms of COVID-19. We are all under different stages of lockdown, and it's been quite a difficult time. But the climate crisis has been with us for several decades now. It's something which we need to respond to. So what it requires in both cases is a very comprehensive and early response to be able to manage the problems coming out of this. The other things which have struck me is that in terms of the lessons learned, obviously the COVID-19 has affected human lives most. And we've seen this on a daily basis. Our frontline staff, medical staff, and so on, who have been responding to this. But in terms of the climate crisis, which is also something which is there with us, it also requires a very large-scale response and a compassionate and proactive one if we are going to address the issues which threaten human lives in the long term. The other thing which occurs to me is that in terms of the pandemic, and for that matter, climate change as well, we are all in this together. There are no borders, there are no boundaries, and so we have to act as one and work together with our partners around the world to be able to resolve and solve this problem. And as Sofia has already mentioned, we are basically living in two worlds. The crisis affects the poorest in our communities the hardest, and we are seeing it now immediately with the COVID crisis. People are going homeless, food is becoming scarce, and so there are millions of people who are the marginal position of society who have now become poor and are unable to cope. The World Bank predicts that an additional 100 million people will be living in poverty by 2030 due to climate action. So you can see that these are huge huge problems which we need to address and deal with. If I may go on, of course, one of the things which has come out immediately with this is that a lot of our pollutant levels, our rivers are cleaner, and we have many examples of this. But of course, it demonstrates that we actually, given the will, we can actually start to make an impact on the environment, which is obviously central to our requirements to deal with climate change in the long term. Of course, in general, the climate change affects all of us, and of course, it's a global problem, and we are looking at it at a local lens. We have issues of sea level rising. It's estimated that this could go up from 30 cm to about above a meter by the turn of the century. So, of course, anything like this is going to affect our economic activity. Tourism is going to be impacted, a very important source of income for Malaysia, for example. We've had frequent flooding, and this is something which we are living with all the time. Coastal cities such as Malacca, Kota Kinabalu, Johor Bahru, and Kuching, for example, are affected, and so are the low-lying states. Then we have the issue of food security, which is at risk. Climate change affects the crop yields. And of course, it's unpredictable, the weather, and therefore this can affect livelihoods of farmers who are at immediate risk. There's also the health impacts, the fact that global warming and heat-related illnesses are going to increase. And then there's the whole issue of the heat island effect, which is obviously going to be something we have to deal with, and we're already dealing with, and needs to be considered. In comparing the two issues, the coronavirus and climate change, one of the things which struck me is that in both cases, you're talking about an exponential growth and then a limited capacity to cope. In the case of coronavirus, you're talking about the danger of the number of people who are infected, people who are basically overwhelming our healthcare systems. And this is why we've been talking about flattening the curve and trying to manage this situation. But of course, this has been on a very small time scale, and it's very likely that particularly if we develop and find a vaccine, that recovery from this will be quick and will be possible. Of course, there's no stopping, no guaranteeing that there will be not another virus which will affect us in the near future. But if you look at climate change, it's actually quite different. I mean, again, it's because of the exponential growth of emissions, which has overwhelmed our ability to manage events such as droughts, floods, and wildfires, which has basically affected our lives quite in difficult ways. But the future, in terms of climate change, is actually a lot more dire, in the sense that if we do not act now, if we don't make changes to our way of life, there won't be a recovery. We are at great tipping points, and the Earth will not be the same ever again, and life may not continue the same way we are expecting. Many climate experts have identified 2020 as being a critical year for this impacts of climate change and global warming. Let's look at some figures here. This is a graph which indicates our carbon levels for the last 800,000 years. And you can see from the graph that there's been a very small band through which the carbon has moved, always below the 300 ppm mark. But look at the last part of that graph. There is this exponential growth, what the scientists are calling the great acceleration, where all of these activities have created a totally different world. If you look at the next graph on the other side, we have just expanded the time frame. And for the last 150 years, this is what's happened. Our carbon emissions have grown exponentially. And since the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of the steam engine, we have been living and using the resources at an alarming rate, a rate which is not sustainable. So over the last decade or so, there has been a lot more understanding of what it is and how do we deal with this climate dilemma. There's this concept of planetary boundaries. What Prof. Johan Rockstrom from Sweden has done is to define safe operating limits for 9 biophysical processes which govern stability and resilience of Earth systems. And you can see that in the graph on the left, where you have these the globe or the circle segmented into these 9 locations. And each of this has different aspects of biophysical processes: climate change, land change, freshwater use, and so on and so forth. But how we are now beginning to look at this is that if we can live our lives within the first planetary boundary, the green zone, as you can see in the diagram, then we are in the safe zone. We can live our lives and not have to deal with the kind of impacts that we're dealing with. But once you go beyond that first zone to the yellow zone, then you are basically in a situation where the risks are getting very, very large, and we have to start to manage it. And when you get into the red zones, we are really in a situation where it becomes very risky indeed. So these boundaries are defined, and by this way we can start to look at which are these biological processes and so on we need to be able to control and bring back to these safe zones. It's a very interesting way of looking at this. And I would encourage all of you to go back and look at the work which has been done over the last 10 years in this area. The planetary risks are basically becoming too large, and what we require is transformative changes to be made for us to be able to carry on living in the same way as we have done in the last 100 years. So arising from all of this, in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement. The UN came up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And Malaysia signed up to this. And Malaysia is a country, and these are some of the goals. We're going to reduce our greenhouse gases by 45%. We're going to become carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to preserve our primary forests, and we're going to keep 50% of our land under forest. So these are all defined in our National Physical Plan number 3. And so we need to look at addressing this, and this is where the community groups and community organizations come in. We have to monitor that these goals are actually being met or being sustained. I come from a community organization called Friends of Bukit, Kiara. Was set up in 2014, basically to protect the sanctity of a green lung, which we live nearby too. The movement actually started much earlier as a Safe Bukit Kiara movement by very committed community leaders in this area. And this is the map of the area to put into context. That green boundary is the remaining 400 acres or 160 hectares of land, which we are trying to protect and gazette. Then you would see also in that diagram right below in orange color, a rectangular piece of land, which is currently under threat of development and something which the community has very vocally resisted against. And we hope this will not go ahead and will not happen, because it will change the face of the green lung as well as the community living in this area. And then you also see there are these blue lines. There's river systems coming up from this green lung, which I will come back to in a subsequent slide. So KL has about 30% of its spaces which are considered green out of land space of about 243 kilometers square. But it's interesting to note that only 9% of this is actually open spaces which are accessible and can be used for social and recreational needs. So it's not surprising that a place like Bukit Kiara, which has got this green lung, has huge numbers of visitors during the weekends, particularly, and is well supported in terms of nature lovers, hikers, and so on. Of course, we know that public spaces are very vital to our healthy living, and increasingly also there's a lot of evidence to show that in terms of our mental state of health, green lungs are very important indeed. The key for us as community organizations is to look at how we increase our level of visibility. And by this, I mean, what we're doing is basically looking at working together with the other community-based organizations and NGOs and moving forward with that in the light, and engaging with our municipalities and our politicians to make sure that these goals which we have signed up to are in fact being adhered to, and we have a plan to actually move forward. This gives an idea of the population density in Kuala Lumpur. You can see in the red light that there is a continuous increase in population and population density. Not surprising, because of course Kuala Lumpur is the main city of Malaysia, and there's a lot of economic opportunity, and people migrate, come into and to work. So we need to contend with that, and we need to work to make sure that our green spaces and our open spaces are keeping in sync with this. As you can see, the green line there, we had a major reduction of that in the beginning of this decade. This is being slightly reversed now because, of course, we signed up to 2015, and some of these, we've got a tree planting campaign which started in 2015, 2016. But the point is that this needs to continue, and it's not very clear how this is going to carry on in the future. More statistics. The one on the left indicates some of our targets, which we have actually decided on in terms of green cover or green space, tree cover. We are estimating that we need to get to a 30% coverage to meet with our guidelines by 2030. Other countries have different other targets. But what is interesting, though, is that at this point in time, our coverage of green spaces or tree coverage is only 17%. And so there's a lot more to be done in the next 10 years for us to be able to achieve this. The figures on the right also indicate similar patterns. You can see that there's some improvements going on, and hopefully with the kind of interventions we are looking at, we can start to achieve these goals, because it's important for us to be able to contribute to this requirements in terms of meeting the climate change challenge. So what are we doing as a community organizations? We've hosted some roundtables to discuss with our partners, to come up with common themes and come up with ways we can work together to highlight issues and also have a common voice. And of course, we have various events which we organize throughout the years. We've done. We had a very successful Earth Day last year. This year, because of the lockdown, we've had to do this online, and we've had a tremendous team who put this together, and that's been great. Then we've had various walks and talks and hiking, and we are also contributing towards our issues to do with our parks and slopes and so on, so that our leaders in the municipalities will be able to engage with us. In terms of, these are some of the green organizations we work with. They are our partners, and we obviously we're looking at increasing this partnership so that we can have a bigger voice in the Klang Valley. In terms of the Bukit Kiara as a green lung, it is also a very important source of rivers. You can see some of the blue lines. There are actually three major rivers, the primary one being Sungai Pechala. There's also Bukit Ayu, and then there's also a river which goes into the Segambut area, in the north of that picture. The point is that there is an important water body in this green lung, and with that, it drains into the rivers which go into our neighboring states and so on. But what is interesting for us is that currently we are actually in the throes of looking at a new structural plan for Kuala Lumpur, which is the 2040 structural plan. This has been published quite recently, and we have been allowed to review this document. And some of these aspects, for example, these border bodies and so on, are not addressed in the structural plans. And it's I think it's something which we need to raise as a community and objections so that we can actually start to to look at some of these things, and being very important to maintaining the sanctity of these areas. The green lung itself, as I say, provides a sponge in terms of water retention. It controls flash floods, and so on and so forth. So if we lose this this green space, it could have major and catastrophic impacts in the community which lives in this area. There are communities around Bukit Kiara, probably right immediately, maybe 30 or so thousand people living around, and so these can become very dire impacts if we don't protect the green lung. We have also done river surveys and so on, and we find that there are there's a lot of wildlife still within the river systems in this area because of its pristine condition, and something which we need to try and preserve in the long term. One of our primary agendas was, in fact, when we started the community-based organization, was to look at gazettement and management of Bukit Kiara. We have been looking at this for many years. In 2007, there was a first light of this happening. There was a cabinet paper. It was approved in 2007, and unfortunately, for various reasons, this never got implemented. And since that time, we have been, basically making our voices heard to try and get this gazettement in place. Over the last year or so, we had very good dialogues with the PH government. There was some movement in this regard, but it's not very clear now whether this will actually go ahead in terms of because we've had a change of government, and there's something which we need to address and pull up on. The other aspect of this is that gazettement of any green lung is only the first step. We need to come up with a robust management plan which takes into consideration all the social, economic, and environmental priorities, so that we can actually start to build on what's actually there. The other aspect of this, the underlying philosophy of this, should be that the civil society's aspirations should be taken into consideration in managing these green lungs. Over the years, what we are finding is that despite the fact that we have policies and principles in place developing some of these requirements, equally we are also starting to lose green lungs and green spaces. Quite recently, for example, in the neighboring state of Selangor, we were suddenly told that a piece of land, a green lung there in Kuala Langat, was going to be degazetted. And this came as a surprise, and it's something which should really not be happening if we are to try and meet our targets for green lung management, which is what is required. So to finish off, we started off by talking about the pandemic crisis and the climate crisis. But I think what is very clear is that we need to respond in a way which is unprecedented if we are going to save the planet. It means changing our lifestyles, doing away with all of our carbon footprints, doing away with gasoline and petrol, and looking at our eating habits. There's a whole range of lifestyle changes which we need to look at in the next 50 years, if we are even going to be able to manage to keep within the overall guidelines which we need to, if we are going to go forward with a planet which we can all live and enjoy. On that basis, let me thank you for listening, and I hope we can engage a little bit more during the question time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kriban. If you'd stay with us here and not leave. And I'd like to invite Sofia back into the room. so we can have a Q&A session. Wow, there's really a lot to digest from both of your presentations, and I'm not sure if I should feel depressed or hopeful. At the moment, it seems to be a sort of an even balance. So I'm hoping that in the next 10 minutes, you can persuade me that I should have hope for these coming years. I want to bring together something that both of you alluded to. So, Sofia, you had something about the number of planet Earths that we need, and I think USA was currently using 5 the resources of 5 planet Earths, and I think it's that by 2050 we'll need 3 planet Earths if we can maintain our current lifestyle for the whole globe. My question is this: if what are you aware of what Malaysia's usage, materials, and what have you? How many planets are we using here in Malaysia? And the other part of that is for Dr. Kriban, the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. Are we realistically going to achieve them by 2050? So maybe Sofia first. I don't know if you have an answer.
So actually, I've been in a session in USM in which we tested the carbon, the planetary reserves of everyone in the audience, and at the elements for Malaysia. Malaysia has between 2.5 and 3 planets. Consumes the resources of between 2.5 and 3. And in the audience, there was one person that had 6 planets. That the test we did with that person, that can very easily be achieved with air travel, to be honest. So, and also the 5 planets in the US is an average. So you have people that have 10 planets and people that have 2 planets. Malaysia is very much.
So, Dr. Kriban, are we going to achieve our Sustainable Development Goals that we were set in 2015?
Well, you know, the goals have been established or have been set, and well, you know, it's a difficult one. Of course, we don't have the data to show this, but you know, I think we just need to look at what's happening in the country. For example, we are talking about achieving, you know, greenhouse gas reductions of 45%. Of that, in fact, 35% are supposed to be internally generated, and 10% are supposed to be coming from outside assistance in terms of development countries assisting us in terms of technology and so on and so forth. You know, when we look at the lifestyle of Malaysians, particularly the middle class Malaysians, where you know we rely totally on you know cars to move around and so on, it does seem a lofty goal unless we have some very impactful decisions which are being taken. Okay, one of the things which have happened in the last couple of years, which has been very good, is that we've set up an MRT system within the Kuala Lumpur area, and that has increased public transport. You know, I think all of us have benefited from that. But a lot more of this has to happen. There has to be a plan for every city in Malaysia. We have to get away from the dependence on vehicles and move away in that sense. But you know, I think on the face of it, it doesn't seem like we are doing enough to address this on a nationwide basis. And then the other things are in terms of forest cover. I know we must understand that you know of the as CO2 is emitted into the environment, more than 50% of that CO2, 25% is actually absorbed by our existing green lungs in the world. And so if you were to remove that, suddenly you know you are into a very dire situation. And then the other 25% is actually taken up by our oceans. So the maintenance of green lungs and so on is actually a very critical factor in terms of absorbing these carbon emissions and so on. And what we are seeing is, on the one hand, we are having a tree planting campaign in Kuala Lumpur to plant 100,000 trees. But on the other hand, in the neighboring areas, we are degazetting green lungs, and we are, allowing development at a pace which is unprecedented. So, there has to be a balance. Obviously, there has to be a balance. We can't stop all development. But I'm hopeful. But I think the only way this is going to move forward is really with community participation. We cannot just leave this to our politicians or government officials. We need to be engaged, and this is something which I hope we can do more of in the next coming period.
Well, that leads nicely into a question that we had from, well, it's actually two questions from one of our attendees called Saleh. And his comment was that people are concerned with short-term and not long-term issues. And how do we overcome this? And what's a better way of getting people to act sustainably? Is it the carrot or the stick? Sofia, would you like to take that?
I think both in different circumstances. For instance, in terms of economic mechanisms, it's pretty clear, it's well studied that for some elements such as green energy subsidies work better. For other types for destruction of green areas, for instance, penalties work. So if we have this studied in terms of economic mechanisms for green action, we can also understand that we can use both type of strategies for other types of action. I think that first, the best thing is for people to understand that have the carrot, so they won't have the stick. That's what I would say.
Yeah, Duncan, could you just repeat the first part of that question? Because I think it was sounded interesting, but I'd like to get that again.
Yeah, I'm having a few internet problems.
No, not worries. So, in terms of
people are concerned with short-term and not long-term issues.
Yeah, sure.
And how do we overcome this? And what's a way of getting people to act sustainably, the carrot or the stick?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just addressing the short-term and the long-term. I think the crisis currently has brought this to a very stark reality. We have responded to this problem within, as Sofia quite aptly showed, within 3 months. Suddenly there was a crisis, and we all responded to this, and so that's been amazing. But the point is that the climate crisis has been with us for 6 decades, at least, and we've known about this, and it's a long-term problem, and all the evidence is there. And again, I think Sofia, what you said about let's believe the science and let's work with the scientists, and not and try and dispel that. So I think the question of we obviously need to be able to respond quickly to issues, communities being affected by floods and other tipping points in the world. We need to obviously respond, but the long-term game is the important one. We need to understand why we are here. The evidence is very clear, there's evidence that to be able to even keep within the guidelines of this 1.5 degrees C temperature change requirements, we have to make some very dramatic changes to the way we live. In fact, the IPCC report about a year or so ago indicated that even if all the guidelines and all the commitments which all the countries have given in 2015 in the Paris Agreement are fulfilled to the letter, we are not going to be achieving the 1.5 degrees C limits. We're going to go up to maybe even up to about 3 degrees. And we know that life cannot be sustained beyond 2 degrees C. So, the long-term issues are very, very important. I think, like Sofia, I believe, we need to deal with this with both aspects, the carrot and the stick. We need to give incentives for people to make changes to their lifestyles, of course. But on the other hand, we need to have regulations and rules, and we need to have both aspects to be able to deal with this.
Okay, Sofia, that's a bit of a depressing portrait that Kriban is painting, and I know you have done work on this. What would you're based in Georgetown? I know you're not as familiar with KL, but if we see a 3-degree rise, what would Georgetown look like with a 3-degree rise? Would you describe life in Georgetown?
Okay, so a 3-degree rise on the current emissions path we will reach a little bit above 3 degrees by 2100. Okay, so the estimates according to this scenario is that by 2050, Georgetown and KL, actually all cities in Malaysia, will experience 200 heat waves, 200 days with heat waves per year. And this is halfway to the 3 degrees into 2100. Okay, so what we are facing right now is, compared with 1980s, in which Malaysia had 20 days per year with heat waves, in 2050 having 200 days per year with heat waves. I think this expresses it will have a climate in 2050. It has been identified by a very interesting study. But the climate that Malaysia will have in 2050 does not exist anywhere on Earth at this moment. So if this is in 2050, you can imagine in 2100, it will be it will not be livable, except maybe inside the forest. Yeah. Because green spaces are buffers for human beings. Most people don't understand that. I don't even understand this very well. Green spaces are the best buffer for human life.
Yeah, I'd come in on that.
We're already at, so I think we maybe have time for just one more question.
Okay.
So I think we just have time for one more question. A lot of people have been asking, what can we do? What can we do as a family? What's low-hanging fruits that we can do as individuals to make a change? And I'm going to try and put these together in a question for each of you to answer. So, as individuals, what action can we take that's relatively easy for us to live more sustainably in terms of climate action? And also, what is the most radical action that we can take as individuals or as a family unit to change the way that we live, that would have the most impact? I guess that's what the question is. And the third part of this question is, what action should we be taking to get more things done? We're up to, is it COP26 this year in Glasgow, I think it is. Yet climate change seems to still be happening. So it's just a talk shop. Do we need to take action as individuals to make our governments change tack?
The COP was cancelled, Duncan. The Glasgow COP was cancelled. Of the COVID-19. Due to the COVID-19 crisis, the Glasgow, I actually think city would be ending for the first time a COP, but it was cancelled. Okay, I can reply to your question. Okay, this is a very individual, very personal reply. So don't extrapolate to other people. I think the most important action we can make is put only people that prioritize climate action in government. This is much more important than any other action, because it is government that will implement the necessary measures for us to create to change the system. So this is the most important, the one that's the most important for me, and the most simple. The most radical would be the one that has the biggest impact in terms of footprints, but has the most personal costs, which is not having children. Like, it is known that the individual action that leads to the smaller carbon footprint is not having children or having one less children. But obviously, it has significant personal costs. Did you ask anything else, or just those two questions?
No, I think that's good. Dr. Kriban, if you'd like to respond as well.
Yeah, I think we certainly can do a lot of things on the personal front. What do you call get involved in a community garden, for example. We have a thriving one here in Tamantun, very well managed. Do composting, do your own gardening. All of these things obviously are things which we all can do as individuals and can start to change life. Shop local. We've been doing this now for the last 2 months, and we should continue this, of course. And of course, make dietary changes. As we know, the amount of energy required to have meat, to produce meat, is several times more than vegetables. So again, those kinds of those are the low-hanging fruits, I would say, which we can actually get involved with on a personal level. On the more radical side, then the other thing, of course, get involved with community organizations, make your voice heard, and then if it comes to it and you realize that things are really not going the way we are expecting them to, and promises are not being kept, then maybe we have to take more radical action. Get out there and protest, whatever it is that takes. And I think there are several levels at which we can actually intervene and provide assistance. But I think the central thing is get involved with the local organizations and be aware of what's going on. I think I think the most important thing is for us all to be aware whether these goals and these requirements which we have signed up to are actually being met, and that's not going to happen unless we get engaged.
Thank you, Dr. Kriban, and thank you to Sofia. I think the message that has really come through to me from both of your presentations is that the responsibility really lies with me, to each of us as individuals. We can't just pass the buck, hope that our politicians are going to do it, our leaders are going to do it. That we need to put pressure onto our politicians, onto our community leaders, and ourselves to make the change that we really have to see immediately. We can't wait any longer for the change. So our time really is up. We're well over time. So thanks to all of you who joined the webinar today, and a special thanks again to Sofia and Kriban for their time and engaging presentation. Our service